I am not a man given to long explanations, and I'll say that at the front so you know what you're getting. The story I'm about to tell you is the plain truth of how I came to have a wife for the second time in my life, and how I was wrong about nearly every assumption I carried into it. I have been wrong before. I don't enjoy it. But I have grown to believe that being wrong about Maren Colby was the luckiest mistake of my 53 years. And that is saying something, because I have been very wrong about a horse trade in Taos that I still think about on bad nights. Her name was Maren Colby when she came to me, and she arrived with 2 trunks, a carpet bag, a set of opinions about how a ledger ought to be kept, and a written list of 6 conditions she considered non-negotiable. I had sent 3, she had doubled them. I'll start where it started, which was with my neighbor Hector Ruiz, who had been trying to solve a problem of mine for 2 years without my asking him to. The problem was the ranch. Not the cattle were fine as anything gets in the Arroyo Blanco Valley in late autumn, which is to say they were alive and heading in the right direction. Not the land, either. I had 640 acres of the best grass in that valley, water from a creek that ran clear 10 months out of 12, a solid house I'd built with my own hands and with Hector's, and with the help of 2 good men named Everett and Rouleau, who had been riding for me since my wife Clara died 11 years before. The land was not the problem. The problem was the house. I had let it go. Not in one big way, I'm not a slovenly man and I kept it clean enough. But a house that has no woman in it for 11 years develops a kind of gray quiet that settles into it like dust into a curtain fold, and you stop seeing it because you stop looking. The kitchen ran. The hearth ran. The roof didn't leak. But there was no order to it beyond the practical, and no warmth beyond the fire. And the books were a disgrace because I am better with cattle than with columns of figures, and every spring for 11 years I had ridden into Cimarron with my hat in my hand to let a man named Hollies sort out what I had tangled. Hollies had died in March. So the problem was, I was a rancher who needed a bookkeeper, a household that needed someone to run it properly, and I was 53 years old and not minded to change any of my habits, but smart enough to know that something had to give. Hector Ruiz came to dinner in September and told me about a widow in Cimarron. Her name is Maren Colby, he said. Schoolteacher. Her husband was a surveyor, died 2 winters ago of the lung fever. She kept school for a year after, but the town brought in a younger woman and she's been taking in sewing and keeping books for the dry goods store. She's 41. She's not in a position to wait, and neither are you. I said I didn't know what he meant by that. He gave me the look he reserved for when I was being deliberately thick. Callum, you haven't had a bookkeeper since March. Your house looks like a bunkhouse. You haven't been to a social gathering in 4 years. You are 53 years old and you eat beans out of a pot because you forget to cook them into anything else. I told him the beans were fine. She's a practical woman, Hector said. Write her a letter, keep it plain, she'll write back. I wrote her a letter that night because Hector has been right about practical things for 30 years and I have learned to listen to him on practical things. I told her my name, the name of my ranch, the size of it, and the county. I told her I was widowed with no children living. I told her I needed someone to run the household and keep the books, and that I was not offering a love match but a fair and honest arrangement with a decent roof, food, regular pay from the ranch proceeds, and my full respect. I told her my 3 conditions. She was to be plain with me about what she needed. She was to leave the management of the cattle entirely to me, and she was not to rearrange my desk. I sent the letter. 9 days later, I received her reply. She had read my letter carefully, she wrote, and she was not opposed to the nature of the arrangement. She had, however, 6 conditions of her own, and she listed them in a numbered column that was the neatest handwriting I had seen in years. The first was that she would keep the books on her own terms and by her own method, and I was not to question her columns unless I found an error. The second was that she would have one afternoon per week entirely to herself, to do with as she pleased, and she would not account for it. The third was that she would not be spoken to sharply in her own kitchen. The fourth was that she would take her meals at the table and not in the kitchen alone. The fifth was that any arrangement between us was to be reviewed honestly at the end of 1 year, at which point either party might end it with no hard feeling and no debt owed. And the sixth was this: she would not pretend to an affection she did not feel, and she expected the same courtesy from me. I read that list 3 times. Then I wrote back and said all 6 were acceptable, and asked what day she could be in Cimarron. We were married on a Tuesday in October at the Cimarron courthouse, with the county clerk and his wife as witnesses. Marin Colby, Marin Draft now, though she kept Colby for how people knew her, and I didn't object, came down the courthouse steps in a dark blue wool dress and a brown coat, and carried herself the way a woman carries herself when she has decided not to be afraid of something. She was not what I had pictured. I had pictured someone softer, perhaps, or more visibly worn down by circumstance. She was neither. She was middle height, with gray coming into dark hair she kept pinned tight, and she had gray eyes that moved over things with the habit of someone who has spent years looking at rooms full of children and noticing who understood and who was faking it. She looked at me the same way. "Mr. Draft," she said, and shook my hand before I could offer it. "Mrs. Colby," I said, and then corrected myself. "Mrs. Draft." "Either will do," she said, and picked up her carpet bag. We drove back to the Arroyo Blanco in my wagon with 2 trunks in the bed and the October light going flat and gold across the valley, and she asked me questions the whole way. Not personal questions, practical ones. How many head did I run and on how many acres? Who rode for me? Whether the creek had ever flooded the south pasture, whether I kept a kitchen garden or relied on Cimarron, whether the stove had a bad eye. I answered every one of them. She listened without looking at me, watching the road and the hills, and once or twice she said, "I see," in a tone that told me she was filing it away. When we came up the drive and she saw the house for the first time, she said nothing at all. She got down from the wagon by herself before I could help her, and she walked up to the porch and opened the front door and went inside. I sat in the wagon for a moment, listening. Then I heard her moving through the rooms, a steady, unhurried walk. The sound of a door opened and closed, a window latch tested. No exclamation of any kind. I brought in her trunks. She was in the kitchen when I set them down, looking at my pot of last night's beans on the back of the stove. "How long have those been there?" she asked. 2 days, I said. She nodded once. "I'll cook tonight. Where do you keep the salt?" I showed her where I kept the salt. That was the first evening. She cooked cornbread and a proper beef stew from a piece of the chuck I hadn't gotten around to. She set the table with 2 plates and 2 cups, which was what her 4th condition required, and she sat across from me and ate without ceremony. We talked about the ranch. She asked more questions and I gave her more answers. She told me about Cimarron, about the school, about how she'd learned to keep books from her father, who had run a hardware supply in Ohio before the family moved west. She talked plainly and without any apparent desire to impress me, which I found more restful than I expected. After supper she washed the dishes and I dried them, which had been my habit alone for 11 years, and she did not tell me to sit down, and I did not tell her I could manage. We moved around the kitchen as if we'd worked out a method, though we hadn't. She went to her room at 9. I sat by the fire and thought about nothing in particular, which was unusual for me. I generally think about the cattle or about what needs doing. But that evening I just sat there, and after a while I noticed the house did not feel as quiet as it had that morning. I told myself that was only because there was someone else in it. The first month was adjustment. She found the ledger books in the second week and spent 2 full evenings going through them without asking me a single question. Then she came to my desk on a Wednesday morning and set a sheet of paper in front of me that showed 3 years of accounts in her hand, reorganized by quarter, with 2 errors I hadn't noticed, and one that I had and had decided to live with. "This one here," she said, pointing to the 3rd error. "You moved $20 from the cattle column to the supply column in the spring of '77. Do you know why?" I did know why. I had bought a new saddle and didn't want to account for it properly. "I misread the figure," I said. She looked at me for a moment with those gray eyes. "All right," she said. "I've corrected it. The books are in order now. I'll keep them quarterly going forward, and you'll sign off at the end of each quarter." She picked up her sheet and went back to the kitchen. I sat at my desk for a while, aware that she had not believed me about the saddle. The kitchen garden had gone to dry stalks by the time she arrived, but she spent her first Saturday clearing it with a methodical thoroughness that Everett and Rouleau both watched from the corral fence as if they couldn't stop themselves. She replanted what could still go in before winter, root vegetables and some herbs she'd brought in a cloth packet in her carpet bag, and staked it and covered it with canvas when the cold came. She said she would have it producing by April. I said I believed her. Everett and Rouleau, who had eaten my beans for 11 years, were in favor of Marin from the first week and grew more visibly in favor of her by the day. She did not baby them, and she did not ignore them. She learned their names on day 1 and used them, and she sent dinner out to the bunkhouse on cold nights without making a production of it. Rouleau, who was a quiet man of 50 who had ridden for me for 9 years, told me once in November that she reminded him of his mother, which I thought was a compliment, and I believe he meant it as one. My own adjustment was slower and less graceful. I'm not a man who has had to account for his habits in 11 years. I leave my coat on the chair by the fire. I take my boots off wherever I happen to be sitting when I decide to take them off. I do not always put the coffee tin back in the same place. I read by the fire at night, and sometimes I fall asleep there, and when I wake I stay where I am because the chair is comfortable, and the walk to the bedroom seems long at 2 in the morning. Marin did not attempt to reform any of this directly. What she did was this. She moved a boot hook and a small basket to the place by the door where I naturally dropped my coat, so that I found myself hanging the coat and sitting to remove my boots without quite meaning to. She put a small ceramic holder on the kitchen shelf at exactly the height my hand went to when I reached for the coffee tin, so the tin lived there, and I started putting it back without thinking about it. She said nothing about any of it. I noticed, after about 3 weeks, that I had stopped leaving my coat on the chair. I said nothing about it either. Her one afternoon a week, Thursdays she chose, she spent in her room with the door closed for the first hour, and then, if the weather allowed, outside. She walked. She had found a path along the creek that ran south through the cottonwoods, and she went there Thursday afternoons with a small book in her coat and came back an hour before supper with color in her face. I never asked what she did there. She never told me. The condition had been clear and I respected it. But I found, as November came and the afternoons shortened, that I was aware of which afternoon it was when Thursday came. Not that I was watching for her, I was not. But I noticed when I heard her door open and her step in the hall, and I noticed when she came back, and the house had a different quality on those afternoons that I did not examine closely. The candle was the first moment of anything real between us. It was the 12th of November, which was Clara's birthday. I had kept the habit for 11 years, lit a single candle on the kitchen table after supper and let it burn down. I did not make a ceremony of it. I did not tell anyone. I simply did it alone, the way you do a thing when there is no one else to do it with you. Marin had gone to her room at 9, as usual. I lit the candle and sat with my coffee and let the evening go. I heard her door open sometime around 10. She came down the hall in her house dress and her wool shawl because the nights were cold now, and she stopped in the kitchen doorway and saw the candle. She looked at it and then at me, and I looked back at her, and neither of us said anything for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "I'll make tea." She put the kettle on. She made 2 cups. She sat down across from me, not at the far end but at the corner, closer than she usually sat. We didn't talk about the candle. We talked about the supply order I needed to make before the end of November, and whether the south pasture fence would hold the winter, and whether Rouleau's cough was the kind worth worrying about. Practical things. The candle burned down. When it went out, she said good night and went back to her room. I sat there in the dark for a while. The next morning she didn't mention it, and neither did I, but after that, on the 12th of every month, not every month, just November, December, January, she came out when she heard me in the kitchen after 9. She didn't ask. She just came, and I found that I had started putting 2 cups out before she appeared. The winter of 1879 into 1880 in the Arroyo Blanco was a hard one, the kind that comes every few years in New Mexico, and reminds you that the land is only loaning itself to you, and could take it back whenever it felt like it. The first real blow came in December, a week before Christmas, and it came fast, the kind of storm that gives you maybe 2 hours of warning if you're watching the sky right. And I had been watching, and I moved the cattle to the near pasture and got the horses in and shuttered the house by the time the wind came. We were snowed in for 4 days. Me, Marin, Everett, and Rouleau. Everett and Rouleau in the bunkhouse, Marin and me in the main house, the range buried under 2 feet. She didn't panic. I had wondered, somewhere in the back of my mind, whether a woman who had come from town would panic in a hard storm, and I had my answer in the first hour. She didn't. She inventoried the kitchen before I thought to ask her to, came back with a count of what we had and how long it would run, and said we should give Everett and Rouleau half the flour because they had less. We took it across in the blizzard. She insisted on coming with me, which I would have argued against if I'd thought argument would work, and I had already learned it wouldn't. And we got back with frost on our coats and her nose red as a coal, and she made hot coffee and didn't mention that she was cold. The 4 days in the house were the longest stretch of time I had spent in close company with another person in 11 years. It was not what I expected, because what I expected was difficulty. I had grown very comfortable with my own company and very particular about my own space, and I had assumed that 4 days snowed in would feel like a constraint I would be glad to be free of. It didn't feel like that. She read in the evenings. She had a small library in one of her trunks, history mostly, and some poetry she didn't advertise, and she read by the fire with her feet tucked under her, and the only light was the fire and the lamp, and the only sound was the wind and the occasional pop from the wood. I worked on my harness and on a bridle that needed replacing, and once I looked up and found her watching me work, and she looked back at her book without embarrassment, as if she had only been resting her eyes. On the second evening she said, without looking up from her book, what was her name? I knew who she meant. I said, Clara. How long were you married? 14 years. She must have loved this place, Marin said. I thought about that. She did, I said. She's the one who planted the cottonwoods along the south path. Marin looked up at that. Those are hers. She planted them the second spring, I said. They were sticks then. She said they'd give shade in 20 years, and she was right. Marin was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I walk under them on Thursdays. I know, I said. She nodded, a small nod, and went back to her book. On the third day she taught me a card game she said her father had played, a complicated business with points that required keeping track of a running count, which I was poor at, and she was very good at. She won 4 hands out of 6 and didn't apologize for it. I told her she might have gone easier on a man who was learning. She said she might have, but had decided against it. I laughed. It was the first time I had laughed at something she'd said, really laughed, and it surprised me more than it seemed to surprise her. On the 4th day, the snow let up and I dug out the bunkhouse, and we got the cattle moved and fed. And Rouleau's cough was worse, and Marin made him a poultice and told him to stay in for 2 days, which he did because she said it with enough authority that even Rouleau, who had been managing his own cough for 30 years, didn't argue. That night she made a proper Christmas supper from what we had. There was a smoked ham I'd been holding, and she found dried apples in the cellar and made a pan of something with them that Everett said was the best thing he'd eaten since his mother's table. We ate together, all four of us, at the big table, and Rouleau told a story about a cattle drive in '68 that went wrong in every direction at once, and Everett laughed so hard he spilled his coffee, and Marin sat at the corner of the table with both hands around her cup and a quiet smile that I found myself looking at more than once. When they'd gone back to the bunkhouse and she was washing up, I stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "That was a good evening." She didn't turn around. "It was," she said. "You didn't have to do all of this," I said. "The ham, the apples." "I wanted to," she said. She rinsed the last plate. "This is my household, Mr. Draft. I'm allowed to want things in it." I said, "Callum." She turned then. She looked at me for a moment with those gray eyes. "Callum," she said, and went to bed. January came cold and clear, which in the Arroyo Blanco is almost worse than the storm because the clear cold is a dry, bone-deep kind that doesn't relent. I rode the range every day and came back with hands that needed thawing, and Marin, without my asking, started leaving a towel warming on the stove hook for when I came in, and a cup of coffee on the back burner, and did not make a point of it. I noticed it every day. In January, she took over the correspondence I had been letting pile up since Holly's died, not just the accounts, but the letters from the cattle buyers and the letters from the land office about the South Pasture Survey, and a dispute with a neighbor 2 counties over about a waterway. She handled all of it. I came in one afternoon to find her at my desk, not rearranging it. I want to be clear. She had kept her word about that absolutely, but working at the cleared corner of it with her own paper, writing 3 letters at once in that precise, unhurried hand. She said without looking up, "The Hendricks buyer wants to come in March. I told him the 3rd week. Is that acceptable?" It was. I said so. "And the land office wants a survey map signed by the property holder," she said. "I have it ready. I just need your signature." She pushed the paper toward me, and I signed it and pushed it back. Our hands came close to each other's and didn't touch, and I was aware of that in a way I found faintly irritating, because I was 53 years old, and past the age of noticing whether my hands were near someone else's. Or I had been. Apparently I was not anymore. February was when I started to understand that the arrangement had shifted without my having agreed to shift it. It wasn't a single moment. It was a series of small things, the way a thaw comes, not in one sudden break but in a dozen places at once, each one small enough to ignore but adding up to something you can't step around. The first was this: she fell ill in the 2nd week of February. Nothing serious, a chest cold, the kind that goes through the valley every winter, that Rouleau had had in December and Everett had had in January, and that I had been waiting for since. She kept on for 2 days before I could tell she was sick, and when I could tell I said so, and she said she was fine, and I said she was not fine and sent her to bed. She argued briefly. I told her that the ranch would not fall apart in 3 days and that she was to sleep and drink the broth I was going to make, and that I had made broth before and it was adequate. She said, "You make beans out of a pot." I said, "I make other things." She looked at me with the calculating look she had when she was deciding whether to press a point. Then she went to bed. I made the broth from a bone I'd been saving and from the herbs she'd dried from her kitchen garden and hung in the corner of the kitchen. It was, if I'm being plain about it, better than adequate. I brought it to her room on a tray and she sat up and ate it without comment. And when she handed the tray back, she looked at the herbs in the corner and then at me, and she said, "You used the time." "And the bay," I said. "That's right," she said, as if I had passed something. She lay back down. I took the tray. At the door she said, "Thank you, Callum." Not Mr. Draft, not the formal edge she kept when she wanted distance. Callum, the way she'd said it once in December, plain and warm and without any ceremony. I said good night and shut the door and stood in the hallway for longer than I needed to. The second thing was a Sunday afternoon in late February when she was recovered, and I was mending the kitchen door hinge, which had stuck since November. She was at the table with her books, not keeping accounts but reading the history, the thick one about the old Spanish settlements, and I was working with a chisel and a new pin and making, I will admit, rather more noise than I needed to. She said, without looking up, "You've been meaning to do that since November." "The hinge has been sticking since November," I said. "I know," she said. "I didn't say anything because you'd get to it when you got to it." I turned to look at her. She was still looking at her book. "Most people would have said something," I said. "I'm not most people," she said. "And you're not the kind of man who needs to be reminded of things that are already on his list." I turned back to the hinge. I worked the pin in and tested the door twice, and it swung clean and quiet. I put the chisel away. "How did you know it was on my list?" I said. "I've been watching how you work since October," she said. She turned a page. "You don't forget things, you wait until the time is right." I thought about that, then I said, "You've been watching how I work." She looked up then, and there was something in those gray eyes that was warmer than I was used to. Or maybe it had been there for a while, and I was only now reading it. "I notice things," she said simply. "It's a habit." "The schoolteacher habit," I said. "The Marin Colby habit," she said. "I've had it longer than I had the school." I put my tools away. She went back to her book, but I sat down in my chair by the fire instead of going back out, and I stayed there for the rest of the afternoon, and neither of us said much. And it was the most comfortable afternoon I'd spent since I couldn't remember when. March came and the cattle buyer came and Marin sat in on the meeting at the kitchen table, which I had not asked her to do and which I did not object to. She said nothing during the negotiating, but she had the ledger open in front of her, and once, when the buyer named a number I was about to accept, she moved her finger to a column on the page and tapped it once, without looking at me. I glanced at the column. She had marked the previous year's price and the one before that, and a figure that showed what we should hold for. I held for it. The buyer grumbled and came up. After he left, she closed the ledger and said, "You would have gotten there." "Probably," I said. "You were faster." She smiled, a real smile, not the polite kind she used when she was keeping her professional distance. It was brief and she turned away from it, but I saw it. In March the kitchen garden started coming up. She had said April, but it was March, because we had had a warm spell in the last week of February, and the root vegetables had decided not to wait. She went out every morning to check on it, and I started going with her on the mornings I didn't have to be out early. It was not a decision I made consciously. I would come downstairs and find her pulling on her coat, and I would pull on my own, and we would go out together in the cold morning, and she would crouch by the beds and tell me what had come up and what hadn't. One morning in the middle of March, she found the first green thing in the furthest bed, a small bright shoot that hadn't been there the day before, and she made a sound that I can only describe as uncalculated delight, brief and soft. The kind of sound you make when you have forgotten that anyone might hear you. She put her finger next to the shoot without touching it and looked at it for a long moment. I stood beside her and looked at it too. "Turnip," she said. "I guessed as much," I said. "Clara's cottonwoods are budding," she said. She hadn't looked up from the shoot. "I saw that yesterday," I said. She stood up and brushed the dirt from her hands and looked south down the creek, where the cottonwoods ran bare and silver against the morning sky, and were just beginning, yes, to show the faintest edge of green at their tips. She had good judgment, Marin said, about the trees. She had good judgment about most things, I said. Marin nodded, then she said, "I'm glad you kept them." "I'd never have cut them," I said. She looked at me then, a long, quiet look, the way she looked at things she was deciding about. Then she said, "I know." We went back inside and I made the coffee and she made the eggs and we ate in the ordinary way, at the table across from each other. And nothing was different and everything was different. And I sat with my coffee after she had gone to start on the accounts, and I thought about what I was going to do about a situation I had not planned on being in. The condition had been clear. 1 year and then an honest review, and either party could end it with no debt and no hard feeling. She had written that condition and I had agreed to it. It was plain in the letter that was still in the drawer of my desk, her precise handwriting on good paper that she had folded in thirds before sealing. The year ended in October. It was April now, which meant I had 6 months. 6 months to decide what I was going to do with a woman who had come into my house on an honest arrangement, and had, without ever intending to cause me any difficulty, become the thing I was most aware of in any given room. I did not tell her any of this. That is not how I am built, and more to the point, I was not certain enough of my own ground to say anything that might tip the arrangement into something neither of us had signed up for. She had been clear in her 6th condition. No pretense of affection that wasn't real. I respected that. I was not going to perform a feeling I wasn't sure of. But I was becoming sure of it. The trouble with becoming sure of something at 53 is that you have had long enough to know exactly what it costs to lose it. I had lost Clara, who had been my compass and my warmth, and the reason the house felt like a house. After that, I had folded up the part of me that needed anyone and put it in a drawer, the way you put a good tool away when you can't use it, and I had managed 11 years on the outside of that drawer just fine. What I had not prepared for was a woman who had the patience and the absolute practical confidence to unpry the drawer without ever touching it directly. She had not tried to reach me. She had simply been there, steady and warm and plain-spoken and competent and alive in every room she walked through, until being reached had happened on its own. In April, I rode fence with Rouleau for 3 days on the South Quarter, and I thought about it the whole time. And Rouleau, who was not a man who asked personal questions, nevertheless said on the second evening by the fire, "She's good for the place." I said, "She is." He said, "And for you." I didn't answer that. He didn't push it. We finished the fence and rode back. Spring brought more work than winter had, and I was grateful for it. The cattle, the planting, the mending from the storm damage, the Hendricks delivery, a fence line that needed replacing on the north pasture. I was out from before first light until after dark on the long days, and Marin kept the house and the accounts and sent dinner to the bunkhouse, and managed Everett's dispute with a supplier in Cimarron by writing one very precise letter that apparently settled the matter permanently, because Everett came in from town holding the letter like a man who had witnessed something remarkable and said, "That woman could run a cattle operation." I said, "She could run anything she decided to run." He looked at me. I looked at the harness I was working. In May, she asked me about the history of the land grant, a complicated business going back to before the territory, to the Spanish colonial grants and the American survey, and the 2-county dispute that her letters had helped settle. She had been reading about it in the history book, the thick one, and she asked questions that showed she had understood it and wanted to understand it better. I told her what I knew, which was the practical end of it, when I'd bought the land from whom, what the survey had found, where the lines ran. She listened and asked follow-up questions, and we were at the table after supper with the survey map between us, and it was 10 o'clock before I noticed the time. "I've kept you up," she said, gathering the map. "I was here by choice," I said. She looked up. The lamp was between us and the light was warm, and she had a smudge of ink on her second finger from making notes, and she looked at me with the deciding look, the one I had come to know, the one that meant she was measuring something. Then she said, "Can I ask you something that is not in either of our lists of conditions?" I said she could. "Are you content here?" she asked. "Not with the ranch, with how things are?" I thought about that with the care it deserved. Yes, I said. So am I, she said quietly. She picked up her notes and the survey map and went to her room. I sat at the table for a long time. Summer was the fullest stretch. The garden was producing by June. She had been right about April and then some. And the kitchen smelled of things it hadn't smelled of since Clara, and Rulo was fully recovered from the cough and riding hard again. And the Arroyo Blanco was at its best in June and July, the grass long and the creek running clear, and the evenings warm enough to sit on the porch. We sat on the porch in the evening sometimes. Not every evening. She had her book and I had my harness and my thinking, and neither of us was the kind of person who needed to feel quiet. But on the good evenings, when the work was done and the air was right, we sat out there and watched the light go off the hills and talked or didn't, and it was the easiest thing I had found in 11 years. She told me about Ohio, about her father's store and the smell of hardware, metal shavings and linseed oil, and the lake that was visible from the hill behind their house in winter when the leaves were down, about her first husband, Thomas Colby, who had been a careful man and a good one, and who had died too young of a thing that should not have taken him. She said he had been kind and that she had loved him and that she still thought about him, but that grief, when you let it run its full length, eventually becomes something you carry rather than something that carries you. I told her about Clara, about the cottonwoods which she already knew, about the way Clara had sung to herself when she cooked, not loud, just under her breath, a habit she was barely aware of. About the 11 years, which I didn't dress up. They were years I had made work, and years I was proud of the ranch for, but years that had been quiet in the ways that cost you. She said, "You didn't think you'd need anyone again." "No," I said. "And now," she said. I looked at the hills. "Now," I said carefully, "I think I was wrong about what I needed." She was quiet. A nighthawk went over low and fast the way they do at dusk. "I haven't pretended," she said, "about anything." "I know," I said. "I don't intend to start," she said. "I know that too," I said. She said, "Good." We sat until the stars came out, then she went in. I stayed on the porch a while longer, and when I came in I found that she had left the kitchen lamp on low, the way she sometimes did when she thought I might be late. I stood in the kitchen and looked at the lamp for a minute. Then I went to bed. Autumn came the way it always does in the Arroyo Blanco, which is like a door closing. One week the evenings are warm and the next the mornings have frost on them, and by the time you've looked up from the work, the hills are gold and the cottonwoods are turning, and the cattle are ready to move. It was September. October was coming, which was the year's end, the 12th of October to be exact, because that was when we had been married and her condition had said 1 year. I did not raise it, she did not raise it. We went about the work of September as we had gone about the work of every month before it, together in the ordinary way, the kitchen in the morning, the porch in the evening, the accounts at the table, the broth when one of us needed it, the garden now going to its fall harvest, the cottonwoods gold along the south path. On the 1st of October, she came back from her Thursday walk with her color up, and a sprig of something yellow from along the creek, and she put it in a glass on the kitchen windowsill without saying what it was or why she'd brought it. I asked, "What is that?" "Rabbit brush," she said. "It's the last thing that blooms before winter." "I know what it is," I said. "I meant why." She looked at the glass. "Because it was there," she said. "And it was pretty." She went to hang up her coat. I looked at the sprig of yellow in the glass on the windowsill for a while. On the 7th of October, I asked Hector Ruiz to come for supper. He came with his wife Alina, and Marin cooked a dinner that Alina told me afterward privately, while Marin and Hector were looking at the garden, was the best cooking that had come out of the Arroyo Blanco ranch since Clara. I said I could not argue with that. Alina said, "She is very good for you." I said, "People keep telling me that." "Because it is true," Alina said, and you look like a man who needs to be told things twice." After they'd gone, Marin washed up and I dried, and we were both quiet, and the October night was coming through the kitchen window cold and sharp, and I thought about what I was going to do and how I was going to do it, because the 12th was 5 days away, and I had spent 6 months deciding what I wanted, and I still could not find the words for it that didn't sound like either too much or too little. I am better with cattle than with words. I have known this about myself for a long time. On the night of the 11th, the eve of the year's end, I stayed up after she had gone to bed. I went to the kitchen table where we kept the accounts. I looked at the ledger in her handwriting, 3 columns, 4 quarters, 2 years of ranch history made orderly and plain and better than anything I could have done alone. I looked at the sprig of rabbit brush still in the glass on the windowsill, dry now but still yellow, still there. I went to the sitting room and to the fireplace, where Clara's photograph had sat on the mantel since I put it there in 1868. I looked at it for a while. Then I said, quietly, "The way you talk to someone in a room that you know is empty but that has never quite felt empty. I think you'd have liked her." I went to the kitchen. I set 2 cups on the table. I put the coffee on because it was late and I was not ready to sleep. Then I did one more thing, which was the thing I had been deciding about for 6 months, and which, in the end, was simple. There was a second chair, a good spindle-back chair that had lived in the corner of the kitchen since the house was built, used when Rouleau or Everett came in for a meal. It had been a spare chair, a guest's chair. I moved it to the table on her side, at the corner closest to the window and the rabbit brush, and I set it square and even, and I moved the lamp so it fell on both sides of the table equally. I sat down. The coffee finished, I poured 2 cups. I heard her door at 10:15, her step in the hall unhurried. She came to the kitchen doorway and stopped. She looked at the 2 cups, at the lamp set between us, at the chair that had been moved from the corner to the table, set square and permanent. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at me. I said, "It's late for coffee." "It is," she said. "The 12th is tomorrow," I said. "I know," she said. I said I moved the chair. She was quiet. The fire had settled and the kitchen was warm and the rabbit brush was still in the glass on the windowsill, dry and yellow. "I see that," she said. "It's a better place for it," I said. She came into the kitchen. She sat down in the chair, her chair now, the one I had placed for her, and she put her hands around the cup I had poured, and she looked at the lamp and the table and the 2 cups set out as if they had always been there. And then she looked at me, and the gray eyes were warm in a way that was not new to me anymore. "Callum," she said. "Marin," I said. We sat together in the kitchen while the lamp burned and the night went on, and outside the cottonwoods were bare now, stripped by the October wind down to their gray branches, Clara's trees standing clean and quiet in the dark. And inside the kitchen was warm and the coffee was good and her hands were around her cup, and I was a man who had spent 11 years alone and had turned out to be wrong about needing anyone after all. She didn't go back to her room that night until late, and when she went she took her cup to the sink and rinsed it and set it neatly beside mine, the way she always did. At the door she stopped and said, "The chair is a good place for it." "I thought so," I said. "Good night," she said. "Good night, Marin," I said. I sat alone in the kitchen for a while after she went. I was not a man who would have found words for it, and I didn't try. But it was there, plain as the 2 cups on the table, plain as the sprig of yellow in the glass, plain as the lamp that burned equal on both sides. The thing I hadn't planned on, the thing that had come in on an October wagon with 2 trunks and 6 conditions, and a handwriting so precise it had made me trust her before I'd decided to. The year was up. She stayed. That was 11 years ago now. I am 64 years old, and I am not a man who has gotten better at long explanations, and I'll stand by what I said at the start. But I'll say this much at the end. A man can be wrong in a way that costs him everything, and he can be wrong in a way that gives him everything. And the difference between those two kinds of wrong is sometimes as small as a letter written by a woman with 6 conditions, and the integrity not to pretend. Marin kept the books. She kept the garden. She kept the agreement in every way she had named it: honesty, no pretense, her Thursday afternoons to herself, which she still takes, down the south path through Clara's cottonwoods. We do not speak of the 12th of November anymore because we don't need to. She puts a candle on the table, and I sit with her, and we drink our coffee and let it burn down, and that is sufficient. The chair has been at that corner of the table for 11 years. It's her chair. The whole kitchen is hers. The whole ranch is hers in every way that matters. I am a man who is very poor at saying things plainly when they are important. So I will just say this. The arrangement was fair and honest, and I am grateful for it. And the person who got the better end of it was me. That is the plain truth, and I'll let it stand.